building had gone quiet except for the squeaking wheels of Mateo's cart, but in the CEO's office, something was terribly wrong. It was past midnight on a Wednesday in late October, and Helix Industries should have been empty. The glass towers that made billionaires by day had surrendered to silence, leaving only the soft hum of security systems and the distant glow of a city that never truly sleeps. Mateo Rivera pushed his cleaning cart through the executive wing, the familiar rhythm of wheels against marble his only companion in the sterile darkness. He'd done this route 1,000 times. Third floor, executive suites, marble so polished it reflected his weathered face back at him, like a question he wasn't sure how to answer. By day, he was dad to 7-year-old Ana, who collected dinosaur facts like treasures, and 5-year-old Luis, who argued that pizza should be its own food group. By night, he was invisible, just another essential worker keeping the world clean while everyone else dreamed. But tonight was different. Tonight, the silence felt wrong. Mateo paused outside the CEO's suite, his hand resting on the cart's worn plastic handle. The door was slightly ajar, which never happened. Cassandra Vale, founder, billionaire, the woman whose face graced magazine covers across 2 continents, was obsessively private about her space. Security protocols, access codes, everything locked down tighter than Fort Knox. He pushed the door open carefully, expecting to find nothing more than a forgotten light or an unclosed window. Instead, he found her. Cassandra Vale was slumped in the leather chair at the head of her conference table, her black blazer draped carelessly over a nearby chair like a shadow that had given up its fight. One expensive heel had been kicked off, lying on its side like evidence of a struggle no one had witnessed. Her phone glowed face down on the polished wood, its screen casting eerie shadows across a face that was too pale, too still. She wasn't breathing right. Mateo's training kicked in, not from any fancy medical school, but from a community CPR class he'd taken 3 years ago when his father had a fainting spell. The instructor's voice echoed in his memory, hard and fast in the center of the chest. Don't think, just act. You might be the difference between someone going home to their family or not. Miss Valle? Mateo called softly, setting down his mop. No response. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular gasps. A thin line of saliva had escaped from the corner of her mouth. Her manicured hand lay limp against the armrest, fingers curled like she was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. This wasn't a CEO. This wasn't a billionaire. This was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone whose story was about to end unless he did something right now. If you think you know how this story ends, think again, because what happened next shocked even the doctors. Mateo didn't think about his lack of medical degree or his minimum wage paycheck. He didn't think about protocols or liability, or whether a janitor had the right to touch a CEO. He thought about Ana asking him why people help strangers and how he'd told her that sometimes we're all each other has. He dialed the building's emergency line with trembling fingers, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. This is Mateo Rivera, 3rd floor maintenance. I need EMTs to the executive suite immediately. The CEO is unconscious and barely breathing. While he waited for help, Mateo did what the instructor had taught him. Head tilt, chin lift. Check for breathing, check for pulse. Her heartbeat was there but erratic, like a song with missing notes. He positioned his hands over her sternum, interlaced his fingers, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm felt both foreign and familiar, like a dance he'd learned long ago but never hoped to need. Cassandra's expensive silk blouse wrinkled under his weathered hands, but all he could think about was Luis asking him once why his hands were so rough. From working hard so we can have nice things, he'd said. Tonight, those rough hands might be the only thing standing between life and death. The EMTs arrived in a blur of uniforms and equipment, their radios crackling with medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language to Mateo's ears. They worked with practiced efficiency, hooking up monitors, checking vitals, preparing her for transport. The sterile conference room transformed into an impromptu emergency ward, all marble and glass suddenly irrelevant next to the urgent business of saving a human life. You did good, one of the EMTs told Mateo as they wheeled Cassandra toward the elevator. That CPR bought her time. Without it. He didn't finish the sentence. but his meaning was clear. As the elevator doors closed, taking Cassandra toward whatever came next, Mateo stood alone in the empty executive suite. His cart waited patiently where he'd left it, the mundane world of mops and disinfectant suddenly feeling surreal after what had just happened. He thought about going home, about crawling into bed and pretending this was all a strange dream. But something kept him rooted in place. Maybe it was the memory of her lifeless hand in his. Maybe it was the thought of Anna and Luis waking up to ask about his night. Or maybe it was something deeper. The understanding that sometimes the universe asks ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and you don't get to know the outcome until you choose to care. 20 minutes later, Mateo Rivera was driving across town to a hospital where he had no business being, following an ambulance that carried a woman whose life he'd helped save. He was just a janitor with a thermos of 2 strong coffee and 2 kids who needed him in the morning. But tonight, he was also something else. He was the first link in a chain of miracles that was about to unfold in ways no one, not even 20 of the country's best doctors, could have predicted. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the gulf between 2 worlds that should never have intersected. In one world, Mateo Rivera woke every morning at 6:30 to the sound of small feet padding across hardwood floors and the eternal question, "Daddy, can dinosaurs eat cereal?" Anna would appear at his bedside with her hair in every direction except the right one, clutching her favorite book about pterodactyls and demanding scientific accuracy from someone who could barely function before coffee. Luis would inevitably follow, dragging his blanket and launching into an elaborate argument about why breakfast should consist entirely of cookies. "Bears eat honey," he'd reason with 5-year-old logic. "Cookies have honey, therefore, I am basically a bear." This was Mateo's universe. School lunches packed with military precision, hair braided while half asleep, bedtime stories read until the book's spine gave up from exhaustion. He worked nights at Helix Industries because the pay was better and the schedule meant he could drop the kids at school every morning, be present for scraped knees and homework tears, be the kind of father his own dad had been before life got complicated. In the other world, Cassandra Vale commanded boardrooms like a general planning strategic victories. She was the woman who turned a college startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire, who gave TED Talks on innovation and appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The CEO Who Never Sleeps." Her glass office on the 40th floor looked out over a city she'd helped shape, and her decisions affected thousands of employees across 12 countries. These worlds weren't supposed to touch. But fate has a way of making its own introductions. At St. Mary's Hospital, those worlds collided in a waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and desperate prayers. Mateo sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing his work uniform, still smelling faintly of floor cleaner and determination. Around him, the medical machinery of one of the country's premier hospitals hummed to life. The cardiology team was already assembling. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist flown in from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Michael Roberts from the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whose pioneering work with mechanical heart pumps had made her a legend in cardiac care. They spoke in the careful, measured tones of people accustomed to life-and-death decisions, their white coats like armor against the chaos of human fragility. "Massive thromboembolism," Dr. Chen explained to the growing team of specialists. "We've performed an emergency catheterization and placed a stent, but there's significant cardiac damage. We're using an Impella device to provide mechanical circulatory support while we assess the full extent of the injury." The Impella, a device no bigger than a pencil that could temporarily take over a heart's work, represented the cutting edge of medical technology. It was the kind of intervention that costs more than most people make in a year, available only to patients with the best insurance and the connections to access America's finest medical minds. But in the corner of the waiting room, a janitor with calloused hands sat wondering if he'd done enough. Every parent watching knows that desperate moment when you do anything to save someone, even a stranger. A nurse approached Mateo with the careful professionalism of someone used to dealing with complicated family dynamics. "Are you family?" she asked. her eyes taking in his work clothes and the visitor's badge that marked him as an outsider in this world of medical hierarchy. "No, ma'am," Matteo replied quietly. "I'm the one who found her. I needed to know she was okay." The nurse's expression softened slightly. She'd seen enough trauma to recognize the look of someone carrying the weight of another person's life. "The doctors are doing everything they can. It's going to be a long night." Matteo nodded, settling back into his chair. He thought about calling his ex-wife to check on the kids, but it was past 2 a.m. and they'd be fast asleep. Anna would wake up asking about his night, the way she always did. He wondered what he'd tell her. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes adults stop breathing and other adults have to help them start again? Hours passed in the strange time warp of hospital waiting. Specialists arrived and departed. Machines beeped in urgent rhythms. Somewhere in the maze of corridors and sterile rooms, Cassandra Vale fought a battle that would determine whether she'd ever see another sunrise. Dr. Chen emerged around 4 a.m., her surgical mask pulled down to reveal the exhausted face of someone who'd spent hours holding death at bay. "She's stable for now," she told the assembled team, "but there's been significant cardiac trauma. We're monitoring for signs of brain injury due to the period of compromised circulation." The words hung in the air like a medical sword of Damocles. Brain injury. In the antiseptic language of hospitals, it meant the difference between recovery and a life forever changed. Matteo leaned forward in his chair. "Doctor, when I found her, she was still breathing. Barely, but her heart was still beating. Does that help?" Dr. Chen studied him with new interest. "You performed CPR?" "Yes, ma'am, until the paramedics arrived. That may have made all the difference," she said quietly. "Those minutes of circulation could be the reason she's alive right now." But alive, they would soon discover, didn't necessarily mean awake. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital walls in soft pink light, Cassandra Vale remained unconscious. The machines sustained her body, while 20 of the nation's finest medical minds struggled to understand what was happening inside her brain. And in the waiting room, a janitor who should have been home making breakfast for his children kept vigil, praying to whatever force governs the intersection of ordinary people and extraordinary moments, that his rough hands had been enough to bridge the gap between two worlds that fate had decided needed to meet. What none of them knew yet was that the real test wasn't whether Cassandra would survive the night. It was whether the medical system that had saved her body would be humble enough to see what a janitor's eyes would soon notice, and whether 20 brilliant doctors would be willing to listen to a man whose only credential was caring enough to pay attention. For 3 days, St. Mary's Hospital became a fortress of medical excellence built around a single, unconscious woman. The specialists arrived like generals summoned to a crucial battle. Dr. Patricia Langley from the National Institutes of Health, whose groundbreaking research in neurological recovery had saved thousands. Dr. James Morrison from Massachusetts General, a cardiologist whose techniques had revolutionized treatment for complex cardiac events. Dr. Susan Park from UCSF, whose work with comatose patients had earned her international recognition. They brought with them the full arsenal of modern medicine: MRI scanners that could peer into the deepest recesses of the brain, EEG machines that translated electrical storms into readable data, blood tests that could detect the smallest molecular changes. Cassandra Vale's room looked like mission control, all blinking monitors and digital readouts. Machines worth more than most people's houses working in perfect harmony to sustain one precious life. But something was missing. The scans show minimal brain trauma, Dr. Watt Langley announced during the morning briefing, her laser pointer dancing across images that looked like abstract art to anyone without a medical degree. Cardiac function is improving with the mechanical support. By all objective measures, she should be showing signs of consciousness by now. Dr. Morrison adjusted his glasses, studying the same data from a different angle. Perhaps we're looking at a psychological component? Trauma-induced catatonia? It's rare in cardiac events, but not impossible. The medical terminology flew around the conference room like weapons in an intellectual duel. Anoxic brain injury, neurological markers, cognitive assessment protocols, each phrase precisely crafted to describe the indescribable mystery of why a brilliant woman's mind remained locked away while her body fought to heal. Down the hall, Matteo sat in the same plastic chair he'd occupied for 3 straight nights, without surviving on hospital cafeteria coffee and determination. Visiting hours meant nothing to him. The night staff had grown used to his quiet presence, this janitor who refused to leave until he knew the woman he'd saved would be okay. He'd tried returning to work, but his supervisor at Helix had given him emergency leave with pay, saying simply, "Family comes first." It wasn't family exactly, but it felt like something just as important. Anna and Luis were staying with their mother, while Daddy dealt with grown-up stuff, as he'd explained it. They'd made him cards before he left, Anna's featuring a stick figure superhero with a mop, Luis's consisting mainly of dinosaur stickers and the words, "Daddy is brave" in crayon. The cards were tucked in his jacket pocket, along with a thermos that had seen better days, and the kind of stubborn hope that keeps ordinary people anchored when extraordinary circumstances threaten to sweep them away. On the 3rd night, as the medical team prepared for another conference about treatment protocols and recovery timelines, Matteo made an observation that would change everything. He was walking past Cassandra's room when he noticed it, a barely perceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth, so subtle it could have been a trick of the fluorescent lighting. But Matteo had spent years cleaning offices, and cleaners develop an eye for detail. They notice when a picture frame is tilted half a degree, when a pen has been moved 3 inches to the left, when something that should be still is moving ever so slightly. Cassandra's fingers flexed against the white hospital sheet. Just once, barely visible, but purposeful in a way that made Matteo's breath catch in his throat. He pressed his face closer to the observation window, watching with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. There. She did it again, a tiny movement of her index finger, coinciding with the sound of a nurse's voice in the hallway. "Nurse," Matteo called out, his voice carrying the urgent edge of someone who'd spotted smoke in a crowded theater. "I think she's trying to respond." Nurse Thompson, a 20-year veteran of the ICU, approached with professional skepticism. She'd seen too many family members project consciousness onto unconscious patients, reading meaning into random muscle spasms and reflexive movements. But something in Matteo's voice made her look twice. "What did you see?" she asked, checking Cassandra's monitors. Her finger moved when you spoke, not random, purposeful, like she was trying to answer. Nurse Thompson watched for several minutes, but Cassandra remained still. "I don't see anything unusual. Sometimes patients have involuntary muscle contractions. It doesn't necessarily indicate consciousness." But Matteo had spent 3 days learning the rhythm of Cassandra's unconscious state. He knew the difference between the random twitches that came with dreams and something that felt intentional. This was different. This was someone trapped behind locked doors, tapping on the walls to let people know they were still there. Drop an emoji if you've ever noticed something important that everyone else missed. The next morning's medical conference featured the same collection of brilliant minds discussing the same puzzling case. Test results were normal. Brain activity showed typical patterns for someone in her condition. All indicators suggested she was receiving the best possible care. But nobody could explain why she remained unresponsive. "Perhaps we need to consider alternative approaches," suggested Dr. Park, her voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone proposing something unconventional. "Sometimes consciousness emerges in ways our standard protocols don't capture." Dr. Morrison frowned at his tablet. "The EEG shows no significant changes. Her brain activity is consistent with deep unconsciousness. I'm not sure what alternative approaches would be appropriate." In the hallway outside, Matteo listened to fragments of medical discussion through the partially open door. Words like prognosis and long-term care facility and family decisions about life support drifted past him like storm clouds on the horizon. Family decisions. Matteo thought about Anna asking him why some people get better and others don't, about Luis wanting to know if the lady he'd helped was going to be okay. How do you explain to children that sometimes even the smartest grown-ups in the world can't see what's right in front of them? That afternoon, Mateo did something that would have gotten him thrown out of any other hospital. He walked past the nurse's station with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, pushed open the door to Cassandra's room, and sat down in the visitor's chair as if he had every right in the world to be there. "Miss Vale," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when one of his children was having a nightmare. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted you to know that you're not alone in there. Your body is healing, but I think your mind is awake. I think you're trying to tell us something, and I'm going to figure out what it is." Cassandra's finger moved. Once, then twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. This time, Mateo was ready. He pulled out his phone and began recording, capturing the subtle movements that 20 brilliant doctors had dismissed as meaningless. For the next hour, he talked to her about his children, about the weather, about the hospital food that was somehow both bland and salty at the same time. And every few minutes, her finger would move, not randomly, but in response to specific words and phrases. When Dr. Langley made her evening rounds and found a janitor sitting beside her patient, her first instinct was to call security. But something in Mateo's expression stopped her. The look of someone who had discovered something important and was trying to figure out how to share it with people who might not want to listen. "Sir, you can't be in here without authorization," she began. But Mateo held up his phone. "Doctor, I need you to watch this. She's not unconscious, she's trapped." What Dr. Langley saw on that phone screen would force her to question everything she thought she knew about consciousness, recovery, and the difference between hearing and listening. More importantly, it would teach her that sometimes the most important diagnoses come not from million-dollar machines, but from people who care enough to pay attention when everyone else has given up hope. The medical miracle that was about to unfold wouldn't come from a breakthrough drug or a revolutionary procedure. It would come from something much simpler and infinitely more powerful. The recognition that healing requires more than just saving the body. It requires seeing the person inside. The phone screen showed 17 minutes of footage that would rewrite everything the medical team thought they knew about their patient. Dr. Patricia Langley sat in stunned silence as Mateo's video played on repeat, each viewing revealing new layers of what she'd missed. Cassandra's finger movements weren't random spasms or reflexive responses. They were deliberate, patterned, conscious attempts at communication from someone trapped inside a body that appeared completely unresponsive. "When did you first notice this?" Dr. Langley asked, her voice carrying the careful, controlled excitement of a scientist confronting evidence that challenged everything she'd been trained to believe. 3 days ago, Mateo replied quietly, "But it's gotten stronger, more purposeful, like she's learning how to reach through whatever's keeping her locked inside." Dr. Langley called an emergency consultation. Within an hour, the hospital's top neurological team had assembled around Cassandra's bedside, their earlier skepticism replaced by the focused intensity of medical professionals witnessing something extraordinary. Dr. Morrison arrived with an EEG technician. Dr. Park brought specialized consciousness assessment tools. Dr. Chen appeared with a portable ultrasound to check for any cardiac complications that might be affecting brain function. The room that had been a quiet sanctuary of unconsciousness suddenly hummed with urgent activity. "Ms. Vale," Dr. Langley said, speaking directly to her patient for the first time in 3 days, "if you can hear me, please move your right index finger once." The response was immediate and unmistakable, a single, deliberate movement that registered on every monitor in the room. "My God," whispered Dr. Park. "She's been conscious this entire time." The implications hit the medical team like a tsunami of professional horror. For 3 days they'd discussed her condition, her prognosis, her future care needs, all within earshot of someone who had been listening to every word. They debated quality-of-life decisions while she lay trapped inside her own body, fully aware but unable to respond in ways their protocols could recognize. Dr. Langley's hands trembled slightly as she continued the assessment. "Miss Vale, if you're experiencing pain, move your finger twice." 2 deliberate movements. If you want to continue treatment, move your finger 3 times. 3 movements. Rapid and desperate. Matteo watched from the corner of the room as 20 brilliant doctors confronted the limitations of their own expertise. All their training, all their sophisticated equipment, all their medical knowledge had failed to see what a janitor with no formal education had recognized simply by paying attention. "We need to establish a more sophisticated communication system immediately," Dr. Langley said, her professional composure barely masking the emotional weight of their discovery. "She's been trying to tell us something for days." But the real breakthrough was yet to come. As the medical team worked to develop communication protocols, Matteo approached Cassandra's bedside with the gentle confidence of someone who had been having one-sided conversations with her for 3 days. He took her hand in both of his rough, calloused hands that had cleaned 1,000 offices and braided countless heads of hair, and spoke with the simplicity that had sustained him through every crisis in his life. "Miss Valle, my name is Matteo Rivera. I'm the one who found you in your office. I know you're scared, and I know you've been trying to tell the doctors you're awake, but they see you now. They understand. You're not alone anymore." What happened next would become part of medical literature, studied in neurology programs and discussed at conferences around the world. Cassandra's finger movements became more complex, more nuanced. Working with Dr. Langley, they established that 1 movement meant yes, 2 meant no, 3 meant she was in pain, and 4 meant she needed something. Over the following hours, using a painstaking process of elimination, they discovered that Cassandra had been conscious for most of her hospitalization. She remembered being found in her office. She remembered the ambulance ride. She remembered every conversation about her condition, every medical consultation, every discussion of potential outcomes. Most remarkably, she remembered Matteo's voice during those first crucial moments when he performed CPR, talking to her as he worked to restart her heart. "Stay with me," he'd said, not knowing if she could hear. "You've got people who need you. Just stay with me." She had stayed. Smash that subscribe button if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The medical team worked through the night to understand what they were dealing with. Locked-in syndrome, they eventually determined, a rare condition where patients appear comatose but retain full consciousness and cognitive function. It's often misdiagnosed, sometimes for years, leaving patients trapped in their own bodies while the world moves on without them. But this case was different. Cassandra's locked-in state was temporary, caused by swelling and inflammation that had prevented her from responding normally while preserving her consciousness. As the cardiac damage healed and the inflammation subsided, her ability to communicate was gradually returning. By dawn, she could move both hands slightly. By mid-morning, she could blink in response to questions. And by afternoon, she managed something that brought tears to the eyes of every medical professional in the room. She whispered a single word, barely audible but clear enough to understand. "Matteo." The janitor who had refused to leave her side stepped closer to her bed, his own eyes wet with tears. "I'm here, Miss Val. You're going to be okay." Her lips moved again, forming words that took tremendous effort but carried the weight of infinite gratitude. "Thank you." Dr. Langley later wrote in her case notes that the recovery that followed was unlike anything she'd witnessed in 30 years of neurology practice. Not because of the medical interventions, though the Impella device and careful cardiac management had been crucial, but because of something more fundamental. Cassandra had fought to stay conscious, not just because of her will to live, but because she had heard a voice telling her she wasn't alone. That voice belonged to a janitor who understood something the medical establishment had forgotten. Healing isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about seeing the person inside and refusing to give up on them, even when all the sophisticated machinery in the world suggests that hope is gone. The real miracle wasn't that Cassandra survived a massive cardiac event. The real miracle was that in a system designed to reduce people to diagnoses and statistics, one person chose to see her as fully human and worthy of attention, even when she couldn't advocate for herself. As news of her recovery began to spread through the hospital, Dr. Langley found herself thinking about all the patients she'd treated over the years, wondering how many times she'd been so focused on the data that she'd failed to see the person generating it. How many locked-in patients had she missed? How many families had she counseled to give up hope when hope was the only thing keeping their loved one anchored to life? But those were questions for another day. Right now, there was only the joy of watching a brilliant woman rediscover her voice and the profound humility of learning that sometimes the most important medical insights come not from years of training or expensive equipment, but from ordinary people who refuse to walk past someone in need. Cassandra's first full sentence, spoken later that evening in a voice hoarse from days of silence, would stay with Mateo Rivera for the rest of his life. I heard every word you said to me. You kept me tethered to the world when I was ready to let go. The healing had only just begun. Within 24 hours, the story had escaped the careful boundaries of hospital confidentiality and exploded into the kind of news cycle that transforms ordinary people into reluctant celebrities. It started with a single tweet from Dr. Langley's research assistant. Locked-in syndrome patient, saved by janitor's observation after 20-plus specialists misdiagnosis. Sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected places. Medical miracle, never give up. By morning, the hospital's phone system was overwhelmed. News vans lined the parking lot like mechanical vultures, waiting for their next meal. Reporters with perfect hair and persistent smiles ambushed anyone in scrubs, desperate for sound bites that could package a complex medical case into digestible television moments. The story they wanted to tell was simple. Heroic janitor saves billionaire CEO. It had all the elements of perfect clickbait. Class contrast, medical drama, an underdog protagonist, and a happy ending that would make audiences feel good about the world for exactly as long as it took to scroll to the next piece of news. The story Mateo wanted to tell was different. He found himself thrust into a media spotlight he'd never asked for, facing cameras that made him sweat, and interviewers who seemed determined to paint him as either a saint or a symbol. Cable news hosts debated the implications of his actions. Op-ed writers used his story to argue for everything from healthcare reform to the dignity of essential workers. Social media exploded with hashtags like Janitor Hero and Essential Workers Matter. But when the reporters shoved microphones in his face and asked him how it felt to be a hero, Mateo's answer was always the same. I'm just a guy. I know how to hold a person and call for help. The media loved heroes who wore unexpected clothing. Janitors and bus drivers and cafeteria workers who defied stereotypes about intelligence and capability. What they struggled to understand was that Mateo didn't see his actions as heroic. He saw them as human. My kids ask me every night what happened at work, he told one persistent reporter. I tell them that sometimes grown-ups get sick, and other grown-ups help them get better. That's not special. That's just what we're supposed to do for each other. But in a world where people regularly walk past suffering, where not my problem had become a default response to other people's crises, basic human decency had somehow become newsworthy. Anna made him a new card while he was dealing with all the attention. This one featured a stick figure family holding hands, with the words, "Daddy helps people," written in careful 7-year-old handwriting. She'd used her favorite purple marker for the letters, and there were dinosaur stickers in each corner because, as she explained seriously, dinosaurs make everything better. Luis, meanwhile, had decided that having a famous dad meant he deserved extra dessert privileges. If you're on TV, he reasoned with 5-year-old logic, then I should get ice cream for dinner. That's how fame works. The cards went back into Mateo's jacket pocket, right next to his thermos and his hospital visitor's badge. Reminders of what actually mattered in a world that seemed determined to make this story about everything except the simple act of noticing when someone needed help. The offers started pouring in almost immediately. Book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements, endorsement opportunities. A talent agent called to discuss leveraging his platform. A publishing house wanted to ghostwrite his memoir. 3 different production companies pitched television adaptations of his story. Mateo turned them all down. I don't want to be famous, he told his ex-wife when she called to check on him. I just want to go back to work and take care of my kids. But the world had different plans. Helix Industries, recognizing both a public relations opportunity and a genuine debt of gratitude, announced the creation of the Rivera Valley Emergency Response Scholarship, a fund to provide CPR training and basic medical education to custodial and maintenance workers throughout the city. The announcement came with a photo opportunity that made Mateo deeply uncomfortable, him standing next to Cassandra in her hospital bed, both of them holding a ceremonial check while photographers captured the moment for posterity. He wore his best shirt, the one he saved for parent-teacher conferences, and tried to smile while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions he didn't know how to answer. But the real change was happening quietly, in places the cameras never went. Teachers at Anna and Luis's school started offering CPR classes for parents. The local health department partnered with community colleges to provide free emergency response training for night shift workers. Hospital administrations began implementing protocols to ensure that patient observations from non-medical staff were taken seriously and properly documented. Most importantly, medical schools started using Cassandra's case to teach students about the limitations of technology-dependent diagnosis and the importance of holistic patient observation. Dr. Langley became a passionate advocate for what she called democratic medicine, the idea that valuable insights about patient care could come from anyone willing to pay attention, regardless of their formal credentials. "We've become so sophisticated in our diagnostic capabilities," she explained in a lecture that would be viewed millions of times online, "that we sometimes forget the most important diagnostic tool we have, the human capacity to notice when something isn't right." But for all the systemic changes and medical reforms that emerged from the case, the most profound transformation was happening in room 314, where a janitor and a CEO were discovering that friendship can form in the most unexpected circumstances. As Cassandra's strength returned and her ability to communicate improved, she and Mateo developed the kind of bond that transcends social boundaries and professional hierarchies. She learned about his children's personalities and school achievements. He learned about her fears during those days of conscious imprisonment, her gratitude for the voice that had kept her anchored to life when giving up would have been easier. "You know what the strangest part was?" Cassandra told him during one of their quiet conversations, away from the media circus swirling around their story. "I could hear everything, but I couldn't let anyone know I was there. Except when you talked to me. Somehow, your voice cut through all the medical noise and reached the part of me that was still fighting." Mateo shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still uncertain how to process the weight of what his simple actions had meant. "I just treated you like a person. That's all." "That's everything," Cassandra replied. "In 3 days of being surrounded by brilliant doctors, you were the only one who saw me instead of my condition." The friendship that grew from that recognition would reshape both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. But first, there were reporters to avoid, offers to decline, and 2 young children who needed their father to come home and explain why sometimes helping people makes the whole world want to talk about you, even when all you want to do is make sure everyone gets to go home safe to their families. The real story was just beginning. 6 months later, the media circus had moved on to other stories, but the ripple effects of that October night continued spreading in ways that would reshape 2 lives and countless others. Cassandra's recovery had been remarkable by any medical standard. The weakness in her left hand had mostly resolved through intensive physical therapy. Her speech, initially slurred and hesitant, had returned to its normal clarity and precision. The scars on her chest from the emergency procedures were fading, becoming just thin lines that reminded her daily of how close she'd come to losing everything. But the most profound changes weren't physical, they were philosophical. Before her cardiac event, Cassandra had lived in the rarefied air of executive decision-making, where human problems were reduced to spreadsheet entries and efficiency metrics. She'd built her empire by maintaining careful distance between herself and the thousands of people who made her success possible. Workers were resources to be optimized, not individuals with families and dreams and fears. Now, she knew what it felt like to be completely powerless, dependent on the kindness and competence of people whose names she'd never bothered to learn. She knew what it meant to lie helpless while others debated her future, to be trapped inside her own body while the world moved on without her input. Most importantly, she knew what it felt like to be saved by someone who saw her as a person worth saving, not because of her wealth or position, but simply because she was human. The board meetings that had once consumed her life now felt surreal. She'd sit in rooms full of executives discussing quarterly projections and market penetration strategies, all while thinking about Mateo's rough hands performing CPR, about the gentle way he'd spoken to her during those terrifying days of conscious paralysis. "We need to restructure the custodial contract," she announced during one particular meeting, interrupting a presentation about cost reduction strategies. "I want to meet with every member of our night maintenance staff, individually, by name." The room fell silent. Board members exchanged glances, the kind of careful looks that asked whether their CEO had fully recovered from her medical trauma. "Cassandra," ventured the CFO carefully, "the custodial staff report to facilities management. There are protocols." "Protocols didn't save my life," Cassandra replied quietly. "A janitor did. I think it's time we acknowledge the people who actually make this place run." That meeting led to the most comprehensive benefits overhaul in Helix Industries' history. Healthcare improvements, educational assistance, childcare support, changes that affected every custodial, maintenance, and service worker in the company. When the financial team balked at the cost, Cassandra's response was swift and non-negotiable. "Find the money. These people keep us operating. It's time we treated them like the essential workers they are." But the real transformation was happening in quieter moments, away from boardrooms and balance sheets. Every Tuesday evening, Cassandra would leave her glass tower and drive across town to a community center in Mateo's neighborhood, where she'd quietly join the advisory board for the emergency response training program that had grown out of their story. She wore jeans and simple sweaters to these meetings, deliberately shedding the armor of expensive suits and executive accessories. The first few meetings had been awkward. Room full of community organizers, teachers, and healthcare workers trying to figure out why a billionaire CEO was sitting in a folding chair, asking thoughtful questions about CPR training, accessibility, and emergency response protocols for low-income communities. But Cassandra had learned to listen in ways her previous life had never required. She asked questions instead of giving answers. She requested advice instead of issuing directives. Slowly, the community members began to see past her wealth and position to the person underneath. Someone who genuinely wanted to understand how to make emergency medical training available to people who couldn't afford expensive courses, but might find themselves in situations where those skills could save lives. "You know what I never understood before?" she told Mateo during one of their regular coffee meetings. "I thought success meant building walls between yourself and problems. Turns out the most successful thing you can do is teach people how to solve problems for each other." Mateo, meanwhile, was navigating his own transformation. The Rivera Valley Scholarship had created opportunities he'd never imagined possible. The program offered full tuition coverage for custodial and maintenance workers who wanted to pursue medical training, emergency response certification, or any education that would help them better serve their communities. He'd enrolled in an EMT training program, attending classes 3 nights a week after his shift at Helix. Ana and Luis had adapted to their father being a student again, helping him study by quizzing him on medical terminology and drawing pictures of ambulances and stethoscopes. "Daddy," Ana announced one evening while he practiced taking blood pressure readings on a training dummy, "when you become a paramedic, will you still read me dinosaur books?" "Every single night," Mateo promised, adjusting the blood pressure cuff. "Paramedics need to know about all kinds of creatures, including extinct ones." The training was challenging in ways that went beyond memorizing protocols and practicing procedures. Mateo was learning to see himself differently, not just as someone who cleaned up after other people's important work, but as someone whose observations and actions could literally mean the difference between life and death. His instructors quickly recognized his natural aptitude for emergency response. He had the calm presence that crisis situations required, the observational skills that came from years of noticing details others missed, and most importantly, the deep empathy that made him see each patient as someone's most important person. "You've got good instincts," his supervisor told him after he'd successfully completed a particularly challenging scenario. "Have you ever considered applying to become a paramedic instructor? We need people who can teach others to see what you see." The offer was tempting, but Matteo wasn't ready to leave Helix Industries. His work there had become something more than just a paycheck. It was a bridge between two worlds that needed to understand each other better. He'd become an unofficial liaison between the executive floors and the service staff, translating concerns in both directions and helping create policies that acknowledged the full humanity of everyone who worked in the building. Plus, there were practical considerations. Anna had started playing soccer and insisted that her father attend every game, cheering from the sidelines with an enthusiasm that embarrassed her in the best possible way. Luis had developed an obsession with cooking shows and demanded that they try new recipes together every weekend, adventures in culinary experimentation that usually ended with more food on the floor than on their plates. The Tuesday community center meetings became a highlight of both their weeks. Cassandra would often stay after official business was finished, helping Anna with homework while Matteo finished his EMT training exercises. Luis had appointed himself as Cassandra's official consultant on matters of playground politics and dessert selection, advice she accepted with the seriousness it deserved. "Miss Cassandra," Luis announced one evening while she helped him with a particularly challenging math problem, "when I grow up, I want to save people like Daddy does." "That's a wonderful goal," Cassandra replied. "What kind of people do you want to save?" Luis considered this with 5-year-old gravity. "All of them," he decided, "but especially the sad ones who need someone to notice they're there." The wisdom of children, Cassandra reflected, often cuts straight to the heart of things that adults made unnecessarily complicated. She thought about her own childhood, about the loneliness of growing up in privilege that insulated her from the very human connections she'd been starving for without realizing it. A year after that October night, the friendship between a janitor and a CEO had evolved into something neither of them had words for. A bond forged in crisis but sustained by mutual respect, shared purpose, and the recognition that the most important work anyone can do is simply paying attention to the people around them. The headlines had long since faded, but the real story was still being written in small moments. In CPR classes taught in community centers, in emergency response protocols that valued input from every level of hospital staff, in children who learned that heroes come in unexpected forms, and in two people who discovered that the most profound transformations happen not when we change the world, but when we allow the world to change us. The revolution wasn't dramatic. It was democratic. It was the quiet understanding that everyone has something valuable to contribute, that the person pushing the mop might see things the person in the corner office has missed, and that sometimes the most important medical intervention is simply refusing to give up on someone when everyone else has stopped looking. 2 years after that October night, Matteo Rivera stood in front of a room full of medical students at Johns Hopkins, wearing his paramedic uniform and holding a card covered in dinosaur stickers. The card was new. Anna made him one every few months now, but the message was always the same: Daddy saves people. This latest version featured a T-Rex wearing a stethoscope, because Anna had recently decided that dinosaurs would have been excellent medical professionals due to their very good listening skills and big hearts. "This is why I do this work," Matteo told the future doctors, holding up Anna's artwork. "Not because I want to be a hero, but because I want my kids to grow up in a world where people notice when someone needs help." The medical students listened with the intensity of people who had chosen a profession dedicated to healing, but were still learning what that actually meant. These were brilliant young people who had mastered organic chemistry and anatomy, who could recite drug interactions and surgical procedures, who were being trained to use the most sophisticated medical technology in human history. But they were also learning that the most advanced diagnostic tool they would ever possess was the simple human capacity to see and care about other people. "How many of you have worked service jobs?" Matteo asked the room. About half the hands went up. "Good. You understand that there's a difference between being invisible and being unimportant. The people who clean your hospitals, who serve your food, who maintain your equipment, they see things you might miss because they're looking at your world from a different angle." Dr. Langley, who had invited Matteo to speak, watched from the back of the room as he shared the story that had become legendary in medical education circles. Not the version the news had reported, dramatic, simplified, designed for television consumption, but the real story with all its complexity and nuance intact. "Cassandra Vale didn't survive because I'm some kind of miracle worker," Matteo explained. "She survived because a lot of people did their jobs well, and because I happened to notice something that 20 brilliant doctors had missed. But here's the thing. Those doctors weren't stupid or careless. They were doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. They were looking at data, analyzing test results, following protocols that save lives every day." A student raised her hand. "So what made the difference?" Matteo smiled, thinking of Luisa's recent observation that questions were more important than answers because questions help you find new things to learn. "I looked at her like she was my daughter," he said simply. "I wasn't thinking about her medical condition or her prognosis or her insurance coverage. I was thinking about the fact that someone was trapped and scared and needed help. When you see a person instead of a patient, you notice different things." The room was quiet as the students absorbed this. Many of them had entered medical school driven by genuine desire to help people. But the grinding demands of coursework and clinical rotations sometimes obscured the human element beneath layers of scientific methodology and professional protocol. "That doesn't mean you should ignore your training or trust instinct over evidence," Matteo continued. "It means you should remember that your patients are people first, and people are complicated in ways that don't always show up on tests." After the lecture, a young woman approached him with questions about the community emergency response programs that had grown out of his experience. She was from a small town where access to advanced medical care was limited, and she wanted to know how to train community members to recognize and respond to medical emergencies. These conversations happened everywhere Matteo spoke now: medical schools, community colleges, hospital conferences, neighborhood meetings. People who understood that saving lives wasn't just the responsibility of licensed professionals, but a collective human obligation that required ordinary people to be prepared for extraordinary moments. The ripple effects had spread far beyond anything he could have imagined that October night when he'd simply done what seemed necessary. The Rivera Valley Emergency Response Training Program now operated in 17 states, providing free CPR and basic medical training to custodial workers, food service employees, security guards, and other frontline workers who were often the first to encounter medical emergencies. The program's motto, suggested by Anna during one of their dinner conversations, was simple: everyone can help someone. Cassandra, meanwhile, had transformed Helix Industries into a model for corporate social responsibility that other companies studied and tried to replicate. The changes went far beyond improved benefits packages. They represented a fundamental shift in how the company thought about the relationship between employers and employees. Every new hire, regardless of position, received emergency response training as part of their orientation. The company's executive floors included designated spaces for employee wellness and community meeting rooms that were available to all staff. Most significantly, Helix had implemented what they called democratic decision-making protocols, systems that ensured input from every level of the organization was considered in policy development. You can't run a company effectively if you only listen to people who think like you, Cassandra explained to a Harvard Business School case study team that was documenting the company's transformation. The best insights often come from people who see your organization from perspectives you never consider. The Harvard researchers were particularly interested in the financial impact of these changes. Employee retention had improved dramatically. Productivity was up, Customer satisfaction scores were at all-time highs. The company's reputation had evolved from successful but cold to successful and caring, attracting both top talent and loyal customers who wanted to support organizations that reflected their values. But the real measure of success wasn't in quarterly reports or efficiency metrics. It was in smaller, more personal transformations. Like the night security guard who noticed irregular breathing patterns in a visitor and successfully performed CPR while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Or the cafeteria worker who recognized signs of stroke in a customer and ensured they received immediate medical attention. Or the maintenance technician who identified a gas leak that could have endangered dozens of people. Each of these incidents was different, but they shared a common thread. Ordinary people who had been trained to pay attention and empowered to act when they noticed someone in need. On the second anniversary of their first meeting, Matteo and Cassandra sat in the same hospital cafeteria where he'd spent those anxious days waiting to learn whether she would recover. The setting was deliberately chosen, not a fancy restaurant or corporate boardroom, but the place where their unlikely friendship had really begun. "I've been thinking about legacy," Cassandra said, stirring sugar into coffee that was still hospital-grade terrible after all this time. "About what we leave behind when we're gone." Matteo nodded, understanding the weight of such thoughts. His own brush with mortality had come secondhand, through watching someone he'd saved fight their way back to life, but it had changed his perspective just as profoundly. "I used to think legacy was about building something that would last forever," Cassandra continued. "Companies, buildings, foundations with my name on them. Now I think it's simpler than that." She gestured toward the hospital around them, where countless small dramas of healing and hope played out every day. Legacy is teaching people how to take care of each other. It's making sure that when someone needs help, there's someone nearby who knows how to provide it. Matteo pulled out his wallet and showed her his latest card from Anna. This one featured both of them as stick figures, standing next to a hospital with the words "Friends Help People" written in careful cursive. Anna had been practicing, with hearts and dinosaurs decorating the margins. "She gets it," he said simply. "Kids understand things we make too complicated. Help people. Care about strangers. Pay attention when something seems wrong. It's not complicated." But simple wasn't the same as easy. Both of them had learned that changing systems and institutions required patience, persistence, and the willingness to have difficult conversations with people who preferred the status quo. It required believing that individual actions could create collective change, even when progress felt impossibly slow. As they prepared to leave the cafeteria, Cassandra asked the question that had been forming in her mind for months: "What do you want people to remember about all this? When our story gets told, what's the most important part?" Matteo considered this, thinking about Anna and Luis and the world they would inherit. He thought about all the emergency response classes he'd taught, all the people who now carried CPR training cards in their wallets, all the small moments of preparedness that might someday prevent tragedy. "I want people to remember that you don't need a medical degree to save a life," he said finally. "You just need to care enough to pay attention and brave enough to act when you see someone who needs help. The rest, all the technical stuff, all the professional protocols, that's important, but it comes after you decide that other people matter." He paused, thinking about the question Anna had asked him just the night before. "Daddy, will there always be people who need saving? And I want people to know that there will always be someone who needs help, and there will always be someone who can provide it. The trick is making sure those people find each other." As they walked toward the parking lot, past the memorial placard that now hung in the hospital lobby, sometimes the person who notices first is the one nobody expects. Both of them carried the quiet satisfaction of work that would continue long after they were gone. The revolution they had started wasn't dramatic or headline-grabbing anymore. It was democratic and sustainable. Teachers training students in emergency response, employers investing in their workers' capacity to help others, communities building networks of care that operated outside traditional medical hierarchies. It was the understanding that healing happens not just in hospitals and clinics, but wherever people choose to see each other's humanity and respond with competence and compassion. It was the recognition that the most important diagnoses often come not from sophisticated equipment, but from simple human attention to other human needs. Most of all, it was the knowledge that ordinary people, equipped with basic skills and unlimited caring, could create extraordinary outcomes, not through miracles or heroics, but through the revolutionary act of refusing to walk past someone who needed help. Mateo drove home to Ana and Luis, who would spend dinner asking about his day and sharing their own adventures in learning and growing. Cassandra returned to her glass tower, but now it felt less like an isolation chamber and more like a platform from which she could see the whole city, all the people working and struggling and helping each other in ways that never made the news but made all the difference in the world. The story that had begun with squeaking cartwheels in a silent building had become something larger than either of them could have imagined. Proof that the most important work anyone can do is simply paying attention to the people around them, and that sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest changes. And somewhere in the city, someone else was learning CPR, someone else was being trained to recognize medical emergencies, someone else was discovering that they had the power to save a life. The revolution continued, one person at a time. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to know their observation matters. And remember, you don't need a title to save a life. You just need to care enough to act. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary thing you can do is simply notice when someone needs help and refuse to walk away. Like this video if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Subscribe for more stories that prove caring is the most powerful force in the world. And drop a comment below about a time when someone's simple act of attention made all the difference in your life. Because this isn't just Mateo and Cassandra's story. It's a reminder that every day, in countless ways, we all have the opportunity to be the person who notices, who acts, who refuses to let someone face their crisis alone. The world needs more people like Mateo Rivera. The question is, will you be one of them?